All right, at this time, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Tirien Steinbach. Tirien Steinbach is the Chief Program Officer at the ACLU of Northern California. In this capacity, she provides support and guidance to the four programmatic departments: legal and policy, communications, organizing, and California advocacy and policy statewide legislation. Prior to joining the ACLU in 2019, Tirien was the Executive Director of the East Bay Community Law Center, a community-based clinical program for Berkeley Law School, and the largest provider of free legal services and policy advocacy in Alameda County. As a lawyer at UBCLC, Tirien founded the Clean Slate Clinic, the nation's first reentry clinic. Tirien also conducts classes and trainings on increasing mindfulness and cultural responsiveness in the law and legal profession. In 2017, she launched the Coalition for Equity and Inclusion in Law, a Bay Area regional cohort of law and policy organizations dedicated to advancing greater cultural equity, inclusion, and diversity in the sector. Tirien serves on the executive advisory boards for Transforming Justice, Center for Mindfulness and Criminal Justice in the People's Conservatory. Tirien received her bachelor's degree from UC Santa Cruz and her law degree from Berkeley Law School, where she served as president of the Berkeley Law Foundation and vice president of the Law Students of African Descent. Tirien is a lifetime Bay Area resident who loves cooking, crafting, and hanging out with her family. She will always cherish her memory of the night she got to dance on stage with Prince.
Tri-City area of Berkeley, Oakland, and San Francisco, but I've been in this area my whole life. Worked in Alameda County, San Francisco, and Costa County, and it's just a privilege. There's such a privilege to be an advocate in the community that I raised you. And I have this picture up on the screen from. Some people might know this if you're ever driving in Berkeley or Oakland. Does anyone know where this is? MLK, that's right. It's Martin Luther King Boulevard. When I was a kid, it was Grove. And there's a freeway entrance that you come to. And when I was a little kid, like, this was how we would go to San Francisco, usually. And going to San Francisco for some reason was, like, the biggest deal. It's, like, bigger than traveling out of state. It was like, we're going to San Francisco. And I would always notice this painted on the road in front from our Dodge, the Dodge yellow dog, we called it, the station wagon. I would always notice this, but I read it wrong. So it said freeway only, obviously, because that was where you had to get onto the freeway. I read it as only way free. And actually I read it like this. Only way free. Like, it was this very profound statement to me. And I still drive the street all the time now with my teenagers. And the Subaru convertible, Subaru station wagon. And I come to realize that this, in my mind as a child, I was like, I would always put the emphasis on a different word, like only way free, or only way free. The only way free. But what really got to me was like, how are we going to get free? Like, what does that mean? What is the path to freedom, like true freedom? And as an adult doing this work of law, whatever sector we are working in the law, it is this noble profession. It is this profession at its core that actually, and we forget this sometimes in the daily work of it, is that actually about how do we as a society organize ourselves in a way where we can get along, where we can resolve issues. where we can move ourselves forward as a society. And I realize now as an adult doing this work in law and in doing the work of how do we start to address the issues, the huge barriers and divisions between different people, the huge sources of anxiety and conflict and stress in the world, but that shows up also in the legal profession. The burdens of bias and bigotry that still show up, how are we going to address it? How are we going to get free of that? The only way is just to go towards it and go towards the discomfort of it and do the work in order to commit to something more noble and better than where we found it when we leave this profession or when we leave our community and our society to our children. So I'm starting with that as my introduction. And I want to say, when I'm speaking, I often convene groups of people, and many of you, maybe in your work you do too, either small groups of people you supervise or even groups in the community that you're bringing together for a clinic or anything in many ways. Or even just when you're convening your family to come together for family dinner. And we're often bringing people together, and one of the ways to actually already bring people together who don't know each other as well is just to have simple like communication agreements. And also to do something that I call connection before content. And so actually we're just going to do a tiny brief one. So the community agreements I have up here are really simple, but I always try to bring them into any group because I don't want to make an assumption that we all come into every room with the same understanding of how one communicates to each other. So these are really simple. Respect, I statements, one voice, all ears, confidentiality. Confidentiality is always a good one with law students and lawyers too. To remind us, especially in California that has the strongest confidentiality protections of any state. So I'm going to do two things really quickly. I've already said that I'm from Berkeley, so this is not going to be as strange as it would be otherwise because I've already disclosed I'm from Berkeley. I will add, I was in fact raised by hippies. That's why I have the name Tirien. So now I've really given you the warning. So I'm asking you to do something really weird, but just go with it. I just tried it out. Here we go. When I say the words, there's a storm coming, I want you to do this. Okay? There's a storm coming. Okay, I'm just going to out him right now. Justin Goodwin Liu do something very similar to this at a law school graduation with 5,000 people once before. So I'm not as embarrassed as I would be because he is a Justice of the Supreme Court of California. So here we go, one more time. There's a storm coming. That was amazing, thank you. Okay, so the connection before content. This is just going to be a really quick one that turns your name. Literally just like a minute each. But just, if it's someone you already know, just introduce yourself again anyway. And we're just going to do one thing. You're just going to say, where's a place you feel like you belong? Like you walk in, and if it was Cheers, you'd be Norm, and everyone would be going, hey, Norm! Or you come home to your family, or wherever it is, someplace that you feel a sense of belonging. That's it. Just share that one thing. Introduce yourself and share that one thing, and then the other person share with you, okay? And I just want to thinking about that sense of belonging. Because I actually think that's the start of any conversation to talk about how do we eliminate, how do we address, how do we move forward through bias. There's a great frame from Professor John Powell, who teaches at UC Berkeley, around othering and belonging. This idea that all of us, in our heart of hearts, whatever else is going on, whatever else is being communicated, want to feel that sense of belonging, want to belong somewhere. Some of you watched the Democratic debate recently, and an interesting and wise thing from an unexpected candidate where he talked about meeting someone who had been part of a white supremacist group for decades and knowing he left it, and how he'd gotten into it at age 14 because he was so lost and had a hard family life, and he said if anyone had come to him then, a coach had come, a teacher, or someone had come, he would have joined up with them. But instead it was a group of or white supremacists who really were preaching a message of hate, and he joined them because they offered him a sense of belonging. That was an actual incredible moment in that, to remind us of something that is just fundamentally true, that we all want to feel a sense of belonging, and that many of us work really hard to feel a sense of belonging in certain places. And when we're knocked off of that sense of belonging, like we feel really good and then someone just says something or something happens. I'll give you an example from me. When I was a younger lawyer, but still, I thought of myself as pretty grown. And I was in my suit and I was in juvenile court. And so I'm with my client who was 15 years old, and I was asked if I was asked to move out of where the lawyers were to go back to where the defendants were supposed to sit. And I just thought, that knocked me out of my sense of belonging. That was just a moment of like, you're not supposed to be here. And I was like, I'm in a suit. And I was also supervising a student who was a young man, and they thought he was the lawyer and I was the client. Wow. But this frame that John Powell uses about othering and belonging, which literally is the basis of thinking about how we create space, how we create community, how do we create actual inclusion, not just as an ideal or an idea, but as a reality, is about the fact that the opposite of othering is not sameness. I don't need to be you to feel like I belong with you. It is belonging. It's just being accepted. It's being forgiven when one makes mistakes. It's being seen as part of the community, even if you look different from other members of that community. And I think that frame is very helpful, and a reminder again that even in moments of great tension, understanding that can be sometimes at the heart of it, is this sense of either not belonging and wanting to, or this sense of having been knocked out of that sense of belonging. So I'm going to back up. This goes back to my teaching law school days and just give a frame. And this is just a frame about the operation of culture. And by culture, I mean all the things that we identify as the people with whom we belong, and often it's about our kind of ethnic or racial identity as culture. That it operates on these different levels, on the very personal, just my own personal culture, on the interpersonal, how we interact with other people, societally, how many people interact together, and then systems and structures. And one of the really hard things about talking about race in particular are other issues of culture where there is a mainstream and there's a margin. So whether it's around gender identity or sexual orientation or immigration status or not, there's a mainstream and a margin. That when we're talking about these things, one of the most difficult things is that people are actually often talking about them on different levels. One person is talking about their very personal experience of something that happened, and another person is talking about these structures that have made these things true or some historical context. And that actually gets very challenging and also can be really painful for people. Because if they're talking about it personally, they feel like people are talking about this in this abstract, academic, above the neck way, and they're talking about it on a feelings level. And so this is just a reminder that sometimes clarifying the level that we're talking about and noticing it can be really helpful. And that actually goes to the way this impacts on this more personal and interpersonal level. This kind of head, heart, hands, or cognitive, that we think about things, behavioral, we act, and affective, how we feel. That again, culture and tensions around whether it's race or other identities or margin and mainstream kind of showing up, that these things can create these tensions for people, but they affect us differently, or the way we handle them is very differently. Again, some people keep really above the neck analyzing and don't talk about feelings. And by the way, as lawyers, we're trained to do that. Literally, I remember professors saying as we went into classes, like, this might bring up some feelings, but we're just going to keep it above the neck, you know. And it's like, oh, okay, I'll just cut off the rest of my body. But we are trained really to keep things at an analytical level, and that is not how people show up in need of legal services. They don't often show up just in a really analytical state, and so really recognizing that as well. So I want to talk a little bit about implicit bias and what that means. And I'm going to assume, because we're in Northern California in 2019, that I'm not having to do a deep dive into explaining what implicit bias is. There has been so much information about it. There's been 65 million points of data on the Harvard Implicit Association test alone around implicit bias. But it is the way that we unconsciously have a preference or an aversion to a group of people or someone who we associate with a group of people. So does anyone take a guess? You can call out, like call and response. Like when we start to be able to tell the difference between races or ethnic identities, not preference, but difference. Yes?
9 months?
9 months?
6 months.
6 months? You guys are looking at these baby pictures, you're like, is that 6 months? Yeah, but 6 months. That's the earliest, the studies that show, and maybe possibly even earlier. And these are studies that show that babies, that can tell a difference. Really importantly, not about placing a value judgment on that difference. Just tell the difference. And then when do children start to place a value judgment on that difference or expressing bias? 4. Right, 3 to 5, good average, 4. So 3 to 5. So that's really for most kids when they're also starting to be in places like preschools or some kind of daycare setting with other kids. And that's a real difference between I notice difference and I place a value judgment on difference. And a lot of what happens in between that I notice different and then I place a value judgment on different. So these are all the studies that are like the doll studies where children pick doll, like children of different ethnicities will all pick the same doll as being the better or the good doll. And they preference lighter skin over darker and things like that. The value judgment comes in later in large part because of what is happening with often well-intending adults in their lives, like teachers and parents, who are, when their children are pointing out difference, are saying, don't point out difference, that's not polite, or oh, that's not, we're all the same, or there's been messaging, and instead of that message being a way of telling children, oh, difference is fine, it actually reinforces that there's something wrong with difference, and actually reinforces what then becomes this issue of actual bias or preference or aversion that starts to show up with children of all different races and ethnicities. Another thing that's happening that again isn't, nefarious, it's really just something that again has been studied more recently, and I'm just going to tell you about one very recent study. So the study was of school teachers of kids these age, 4 to 5-year-olds. And it was a group intention, it was actually a video, so it was a constructed thing of a group of kids of all different ethnicities playing together in a school setting. And these teachers, again, of all different ethnicities were told, watch these children. If you see antisocial behavior of any kind, even a whiff of antisocial behavior, click the X button, right? So watch this 30-minute video videos and click the X if you see anything. And some teachers watched the whole thing and never clicked. They were like, I didn't really see anything. Some people clicked a lot. And then we had to go back to the tape and say, well, what was the antisocial behavior you saw? Okay, that wasn't actually the study. So there were the folks the scientists who designed this study had created a video that had what they considered and was evaluated as no antisocial behavior whatsoever. The study was tracking where the eyes of the teachers went when they were told they were looking for antisocial behavior. And I could tell by the murmurs that you know where those eyes went. They went to the black boys in the room. That of all the teachers, they used the most time spent watching for antisocial behavior was watching the young black boys in that video. That is really telling about what happens between that age of 6 months and what starts to develop in kids. Again, not an intention, but the impacts of that significant. So how does this take shape for all of us? We have 1 million points of data coming into our brain any and every given moment. This is now what they get by having those little electrode skull caps put on people's heads. They can see all this activity happening in people's brains and what kind of information is being taken in. Very, very, very little of this, and this will feel familiar to those of you who are parents. It seems like even less for parents. But very little of this is processed in any kind of conscious way, right? So lots of this data is coming in, and it's through the 5 senses. It's also memory, it's projection, all sorts of information. Very little of it is that we're really aware of digesting. And very little of it is processed where we process kind of emotional cognition. So we take that information and we create shortcuts in our brain in order to interpret it better and navigate our lives and be safe. If you think about this from an early human perspective, your only question really was, is it food or am I food? And that was what we were trying to process, and the schemas that we created then were just literally in order to make that determination. And that kind of processing also triggered, in our amygdala a response so that we could react to things that when we were in danger, fight, flight, freeze, appease, that we would have a way to process things when we were, in fact, maybe going to be food. And all of that is happening at such a rapid pace that we often aren't really even paying attention to it. Now, most of us are not worried that we might be food most of the days. Is that probably accurate for this room? I think so. Okay. But there are lots of other, and there are people, not that they're going to be food, but who live a life that's probably far more precarious than the people in this room. But we do have many things that we are processing every day that feel and trigger these same kind of emotional responses and certainly require us to do these shortcut schemas and make assessments all day long. And even if it's not actually the same kind of, like, this is immediately I'm in danger, that's how it actually arises for us. And I think of that as sort of how our modern amygdala responds to things. So schemas also are influenced just by the air in which we breathe and the movies or TV shows that we watch. There's incredible evidence of how implicit bias kind of formulates and also what kind of impacts it has in the world. In actually many of the universities just in the areas that we are living in, there are studies that show the real deadly effects of implicit bias in areas of how and when law enforcement take out their guns or not in encounters. There's lots of issues in every sector of actually where the law or the legal processes touch on to get to this issue of implicit bias, which is why the Bar Association and the ABA and the courts are taking it so seriously. So at the heart of connecting this issue, that the legal profession should take seriously. And what I started, which was the sense of belonging. I have an exercise. Now I want to ask of you, those of you opening up the paper, not to open up the paper yet. And if you have a pen, if you need a pen, maybe there's some that we can hand out. But what I come to recognize in this work with different organizations and different groups of lawyers is so much of this comes down to a sense of trust. People feeling trusted to do their work, people feeling trust that their advocate and their lawyer will take care of them, people feeling trust that their judge will take the facts and really render a decision that was impartial and unbiased. But there's a lot of issues around trust right now in our society. And I want to do a quick exercise with you, which is why I'm asking you, if you open up the exercise first, if you unfold it, you're not cheating me, you're cheating yourself. You're cheating yourself with a little insight you could have from this exercise. So keep it folded. So the first section is just to write your name at the top and write down the name or initials. You're not turning this into anyone. It is not an exam. It will not be graded. It's just for you. But it's just to write your name and then to write down the name and initials of like 5 to 7 people you trust. And by trust, I mean in a personal way, like I trust them with my cat or my keys or my kids. Or in a professional way, I trust them with an assignment that I needed to pass on because I suddenly had a conflict. Or I trust that if I make a mistake, they will not attribute that to me as a colleague, but will actually forgive me and let me keep doing my work well. Just think about trust. And I know there's at least like 3 of you. I think I've got you in my sights who are sitting there and they're saying in their head, I trust no one. I'm so sorry about that. And I hope something changes. But no, I hope that's not true. If you literally are only putting down blood relatives, think about if there's anyone else that you trust. And then you can put more people if you want. I love it. People are like, I have another sheet. I have so many people I trust. They're my heroes. So when you're done writing down the names, you can, in fact, those of you who already have, open up the sheet. And this just asks you to think about diversity dimensions of the folks that you just listed. Again, this is just for you. If you want to share, you can, but you do not have to. And the idea is to look at these diversity dimensions. If there's any clarifying questions, let me know. But otherwise, you're just writing down what you know. There might be some categories where you're like, I don't know. I don't know about that. That's interesting, too. If you don't know, you just put a question mark or write IDK, which is what my kids write, and I don't know what they're talking about. I don't know. So the idea of this exercise is really just to notice if there's any kind of patterns that you see, if there's any commonalities, if there's any commonalities to you in the list that you write. If there's anything that jumps out at you. I did this exercise for the first time a while ago, and as someone who had the power to hire and fire people as an employer, as a director, someone who had the power as a lawyer to make decisions about clients and also my work on client cases or strategy or how I communicate with clients. As someone who taught and supervised future lawyers who would be in the profession with me. It gave me some pause to see this, to see where, because what it showed me a little was just not my aversion bias, but my preference bias. That I had, like everybody does, I like you, you're like me bias. Either you're like me, or I just like you. And that bias comes up for people all the time. So I'll just confess, the first time I did this, 2 patterns jumped out at me. I had far more women than men on my list. Not surprising. And in fact, cisgender women, and it's not surprising that it was women. Although I was raised with men, so I didn't, that was interesting. Another thing I noticed is that 9 out of 10 that I put were college educated or above. And I thought that was actually really interesting because that is not in reflection the people I know or everyone in my life or the people I work closest with even. And that was really interesting for me to see too. And to be honest, from the time I did this exercise, it gave me a little bit of a frame to notice when I was having I like you, you're like me bias, or when I was having the opposite, where I was having something where it didn't click with someone, or the way someone was talking to me put me on edge or put on my back, or I was responding defensively. And I took this technique that I learned actually from a parenting book. So forgive me, but I did change it a little. So in the parenting book, and this is for anyone who's parenting teenagers, when my kids became teenagers, I desperately needed books. And it was called Wait. And the parenting book was, Why Am I Talking? It was like, your kid comes to you and tells you something, asks you something completely off the wall, or tells you something outrageous, and you immediately want to start whatever. And it was just like, pause, why am I talking? Maybe I should just slow down before I open my mouth. Is this about their health and safety, or is it about them embarrassing me and trying to leave the house looking like that, or whatever? But I changed it to, why am I tripping? Like when I was realizing that I was having an aversion to someone, I wanted to ask myself, like, why am I tripping? Like, why? Or I want to say no to a request from this person, and if I thought about it really, if it was from this other person, I might say yes instead. So I had to ask myself, why am I tripping? So just like wait and see, and actually pay attention a little bit. But trust is huge. Distrust is huge. Trust is easier to build with the people who are like me or I like you. Trust is harder to build and far easier to break across lines of difference. Trust is harder to build and easier to break across lines of difference. And that is really, really, really critical in all aspects of our lives, but particularly in the area of law, where we are trusted. Trust is our stock and our trade. Trust is how we build reputations, how we do our work, how we exist as a sector and as a profession. And so trust and recognizing where we have it and where we're going is a really important starting place for thinking about places where we could build it better or rebuild it when it's broken or not break it to begin with. And especially, again, across lines of difference. So I talk a lot about implicit bias, and I've started to talk about it in this terrible, terrible way that's horribly depressing. I started talking about it like global climate change. Okay, if I was in a different audience, I might not say this, but I'm going to just try this. Is there anyone who wants to come up here and argue that there's no such thing as global climate change? Even if you thought, even if you thought that, you probably wouldn't because we're in Northern California. But a lot of people believe there is global climate change. Most people, and certainly most scientists. Why do people believe there's global climate change? Huh? Yeah?
The vast majority of scientists agree that
Right.
it's occurring.
So proven by science is a really big one. And then some people actually feel like we can actually observe this all the time. If you go tracking what's happening in Venice right now, so proven by science, we have our own observation. My children will grow up to say, oh, it's fall, get out your masks. I mean, that is like a reality for us. But why I also talk about this as implicit biases like global climate change is I actually think it has culturally and societally as harmful impacts. That it literally is deadly for some and really, really inconvenient for others. And then for some, it really is something that either we know we're contributing to every day, or we are actually intentionally trying not to contribute to every day. Every day I contribute to the problems of global climate change, and every day I have an opportunity to make a choice not to. And fixing either one of these problems is not going to just be our individual use of a one-time straw or not. It's not going to be that, or me driving my Prius or not. It's going to take both structural change and individual change. And so I started to talk about these things together. Yeah?
I think there's a real problem here because I don't believe in climate change. I don't believe in evolution because it's not a question of belief, it's a fact.
Well, then this metaphor does not work for you, sir. Thank you. But if you're with me, I'm going to give you another metaphor, and we'll see if that works for you. And this isn't mine. This is actually from Beverly Tatum. So she wrote about this in a book called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in a Classroom? She talks about cultural racism, that the cultural images and messages that affirm the assumed superiority of whites and the assumed inferiority of people of color is like a smog in the air. Sometimes it's so thick it's visible, other times it's less apparent, but always, day in and day out, we're breathing it in. None of us introduce ourselves as smog breathers, and most of us don't want to be described as prejudiced. But if we live in a smoggy place, how can we avoid breathing in the air? And the idea of that is just that we do have some accountability and some role to play in whether or not we engage with each other individually, or collectively, or societally, to eliminate bias or to alleviate the impacts of bias, or whether we keep contributing to it. So I have another exercise, but I'm actually going to do it as homework. And this goes to the point I was trying to make earlier about we all are in the mainstream, and we all have ways in which we're on the margin. Meaning anyone in this room, because you're coming to a bar association event, and getting your MCLE credits, which means you're required to, because you're part of a very small and somewhat elite profession. All of us have privilege, and all of us also have ways that we're on the downside of privilege. And so I'm going to hand out this exercise, but I'm going to give it to you as something you can, or it's been handed out, thank you. But it's something you can do for homework. But I'll just show you, just for me again, doing this exercise. So I'm someone who is an African-American woman. My mother's African-American, my father's white, so I'm also mixed. And I grew up in Berkeley, which already tells you something about, because Berkeley is becoming very difficult to live in terms of the costs. But when I did this exercise for the first time, it was really interesting to see the ways in which I felt like on the margin and in the mainstream in different ways. And noticing that was really helpful too, because there's ways that significantly around race and gender, especially in the legal profession, that feeling on the margins is very challenging to navigate. And so that if you're not in the margins in those ways, sometimes you might not know how challenging it is to navigate. Like that example I gave about being mistaken for a defendant in juvenile court when I was the lawyer. That might seem like a small thing or a funny thing, but cumulatively that message over and over again, you do not belong in this profession, is actually very wearing and exhausting and challenging. So just a note though on this grid is that these aren't, culture and cultural identity is all contextual. It's not a binary of just upside or downside. I just want to point that out. That these privileges are not all equivalent. They're not all comparable. They're not all ways that are visible in ways that can be as challenging as some, like race or gender identity. But becoming aware of privilege is a way that we can start to pay attention to this, and not as a burden or like a shame in any way, but really as an opportunity to learn and grow and move towards this noble idea of a just and inclusive world. So how do we disrupt bias? How do we disrupt bias on a personal or interpersonal level is actually just by starting to acknowledge it, And this list that actually I'm showing up here is having gone through many different trainings on this and also reading many books, is that they come down to, or just really great TED Talks, but they come down to some simple things. The first is kind of acknowledging and paying attention to it. It is true, if you do not believe bias exists, you will not in any way pay attention to the idea of trying to do anything about it. But we are in a profession, at least, that it acknowledges that bias does exist and it's a problem in our systems that we should be addressing. So by paying attention to it, situating ourselves culturally, that when we start with ourselves, like that trust exercise, or even that exercise we did of belonging, that we kind of remember and can connect to the fact that other people have their own lives and their own struggles or their own places they feel a sense of belonging or not, and just remembering that. There's training on implicit bias. This one is more about how our different approaches or different ways of thinking about it, but there are things like the implicit association test at the Harvard site and other trainings that are very specifically about counter-stereotypic training, so getting more images or getting more exposure to people outside of our own, sometimes narrow social circles. Building empathy, although some might argue that that's actually not possible to learn empathy. I hope that's not true. But I think actually in the profession, if people just simulated empathy, that would be okay. They might not have to deeply feel it. If they did just a mental exercise of proximity, like a proximate simulacrum of empathy, I think that would be enough. Engaging in processing, slowing down. When I said the wait, why am I talking or why am I tripping, those are literally cues for me just to slow down my thinking so that the next thing out of my mouth is responsive and not reactive. And so that I'm paying more attention. Another one that is used in meditation training is stop, which is stop, take a breath, observe, perceive. Stop, wait. They're just cues to just for in a minute to pay a little bit more attention. And remarkably, you can just take that second. This is a technique you can draw on to just slow down your thinking. That other things that you might do to do that, like take a beautiful hike up in the woods, or get a massage or a bubble bath. You can't draw on that when you're in court or in the middle of a mediation or conflict. Excuse me, Your Honor, I'm going to go take a 10-mile hike, but I'll be back when I've grounded myself. Awesome. Can we get a bubble bath in that extra room down the hall? Although they are starting to put massage chairs in many law offices. And so that's why I have the last one, mindfulness practices. I actually do, I just today had a little mindful meditation session at the old ACLU, which, by the way, ACLU lawyers, they take themselves very seriously, so it's very funny and fun to get them to come meditate in my office. But it's actually literally just sitting meditation for like a couple minutes, just in the middle of the day. And I used to teach this to all sorts of law students. One of the things that's crucial, especially again around the interpersonal and the personal, is that we're communicating a lot more than with what we say. Some of you are familiar with the Moravian 7-38-55 rule, which I love how it's so specific, those numbers. Some of you might be familiar about this idea that we communicate only 7% of what we are communicating to other people. Now, this isn't true with text messaging, although we do have emoji buttons. So, but 7% of what we're saying is communicated. The rest is in tone, 38%, and the rest is in body language, 55%. Now, those really familiar with this Dr. Moravian formula know that this is a little bit not exactly true. It was a very, very specific experiment that he was conducted that got attributed to like all human communication. I really like how the screens keep blanking out. The next time it does that, I'm gonna break into song and everyone's gonna be sorry. Yeah. I'm gonna do an interpretive dance. Drum circle. No. Okay. So it's not exactly true, this formula, but actually what's interesting is the experiments that he was conducted were face-to-face communications about hard topics. So actually, and that's a simplification. But so I actually do think it's interesting to think about how much we are not communicating through the words that we say, that we're actually communicating through our body language and our tone, which is actually why text messaging and emails can get so off the rails so quickly, because it's hard to read those things. And so just remembering that we're often communicating more than we think in our body language about our aversion and about our preferences towards people. So I have a little acronym, another little acronym that I like, of fresh air. It's actually really just so I can get the picture of the Air Jordans up there. But the idea is that, like, you know, with all that smog and maybe fake global warming metaphors, that I wanted to give you a fresh air. And the idea is just that we can slow down, we can pay a little more attention, we can set our intention. My intention is to engage with people with empathy and clarity, that I will engage with people with more curiosity than maybe I have shown. That I will engage with people with an intention around connection rather than disconnection. And that finally that we will retain these practices, that this kind of a training isn't like, oh, I got that training with Tirien Steinbach, I'm good, I'm the best thing. I'm done. The real retention is that this is something we're going to have to keep doing over time and work on as our culture and our society gets more and more complex and more diverse, and where there are these lines of difference that we have to overcome to actually be reminded of how much we have in common. So how do we disrupt bias on an interpersonal and societal level? Work towards greater inclusion. Who's in this room? Who's not? How do we reduce barriers to people being in this room? How is power distributed? Who occupies places of power? Work towards greater diversity at every level of decision making and in our sector in particular. How do we disrupt it structurally? I do not know. I leave that to my teenagers and our kids as well. I don't know. But one thing that's really true is that lawyers, again, across the field have incredible power to change laws, to change practices, to change culture. We have a profession in California that is over 80% white in a state that is far, far more diverse. And there's some disconnect that this profession that holds such power and privilege and is such a, and is literally the feeder of also politicians and judges and people who care very deeply, I hope, about our society, that we don't have more diversity in different professions. So I do think we need to work towards greater. And then there is this idea of resisting kind of folks who are advocating for hate or advocating for division or exclusion, and I reject that. And I think that we instead should frame our ideas around this in the world and in this work as always being about being part of maybe what we might see as being resisted, but this future that is inclusive and equitable and diverse. But those are values that I hope we all share, and especially as lawyers who have signed on, whatever we went into the law for, but we signed on to this great and noble profession, that we have some commitment to that. When we center equity in the middle of this work, I think of this as diversity as being just around getting a beautiful vase of flowers that will wither and die, and that equity is like getting a plot of land and having to build a garden out of nothing. That we work and we toil and we water and we weed, but at the end we get something better than just flowers that will die. We get a bounty that nourishes us, and something that we've had to work for that is valuable just because of that. So what do we all want? Cocktail hour, yes! But we also all want a sense of belonging. We all have ways we identify of how we belong, our cultures. We all have biases, and collectively we're all exposed to some very common virulent biases that can other people. Our biases can arise and be communicated unintentionally and can cause harm. And it takes attention and intention and retention to disrupt, mitigate, and change these biases. But by reducing them, we can achieve something greater, something more inclusive, something I think we can be proud of. So thank you so much for your time. I think it is just about time. Yes!